you very much, Arne, for your generous introduction. I appreciate very much your concern and, of course, the atmosphere of this particular campus, the intellectual elements of this campus, and the faculty who are working diligently as intellectuals and as workers in the classroom and outside of the classroom. Allow me to just introduce this particular lecture to you by focusing on the glimpse of what this book is all about. My hope, of course, has been to write a book, in addition to everything else that I've written, to be under 300 pages. And of course, Macmillan was responsible for that. I thank them for that. To be succinct enough to connect things together and to bring 3 or 4 strands of literature together, weaving it together, so that could define what is going on at the present time in the polity. In other words, political economy is my forte, as some of you know, and economics in the axiomatic sense doesn't have anything to do in my lexicon at all. To be able to do that today, what I thought, and for the sake of students particularly, I thought I should visualize things, and this is a PowerPoint. A PowerPoint which hopefully intends to bring together 3 or 4 things. One is what is oil, the evolution of it. In other words, oil is a moving target, qualitatively changing from colonial times to the present. And that is the constant element of the polity of today, at least the talk of it, is the bottom of it. Second, the question of Pax Americana. The Pax Americana, the polity and economy. Polity and economy are together. Polity is dealing with the realms of politics, with all the institutions and everything else connected with the economy and connects to the economics, which is dealing with all the other institutions. Therefore, institutions matter very much. And also, the theory which would bring them together is a unified theory, at least I intended to present it as such. I worked about 4 decades actually on it. To also look at the other side of the issue, which is ecosystem. Because we're dealing with energy and oil. Oil is a culprit, there's no question about it. Global warming is no joke anymore. And the majority of sane people accept that there is a man-made global warming, at least man and woman made for that matter. 60, 65%. We're not saying 100%. We're not exaggerating at all. So in that sense, when we look at oil as a core, then one, and of course, price determination of oil is also impinging upon all other forms of energy. For some of us who think that, wind energy is different or nuclear is different, I already demonstrated that oil determines the pricing and long-term prices of all energy. And for that matter also, the United States, the oil in the lower 48 states of the United States is determining the core of the long-term pricing of oil everywhere. So, without any further ado, let me go through oil, the process of evolution of it, and then hopefully we look at the post-war system of Pax Americana, and then look at hegemony. The word hegemony is also a very difficult word, and this, of course, is not particular to lay people. technical people, PhDs. I've seen PhDs, brand new, nice, bright. They didn't know some of them, some other institutions, what the meaning of hegemony is. And I had to talk to their advisors, just brand new graduates and so forth. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Anyway, if you, and I'm going to go just very quickly to this, step by step. International Petroleum Cartel has been a very important mover and shaker of the first part of the oil development. In other words, oil came about in a colonial or semi-colonial form through this particular cartel. As you can see, these are just sort of, I revised the 7 principles of the so-called Aknakri, agreement, which was based on the get-together of 3 big companies, oil companies, namely Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon, right, today. Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British Petroleum, which of course was nationalized by Mossadegh and then denationalized after the coup d'etat of 1953, as you mentioned very eloquently, Mossadegh's removal, and Royal Dutch Shell. These 3 big ones, and of course there were few others who were sitting like the soldiers, foot soldiers, at the foot of these 3 generals, full generals, 4-star, in the oil business, and then they divide the entire world. Look at what they thought. This is cartel. This is a very classical cartel that we talk about in economics. Maintaining the market shares of everybody who's joining as is, they call it as is agreement, that's why they say that. And then, of course, when they join, then they manipulate, they organize things. They estimate the demand and then produce. They cordon off the regions, production of regions from each other, so that the oil from one region won't go to another region. And all those things. And you can imagine how much effort and how much institutional setup they have they got to put into this effort, rather than, of course, in the market, in the so-called free market, of course, you don't need to do that, obviously. And of course, adding facilities means what? Means that if they are taking over the independent oil companies and so forth, maintaining the financial advantage of a geographical area, that means that if in the Persian Gulf area, which has cost of production is lower than, for instance, in the Gulf of Mexico, comparison of the American oil and the Middle Eastern oil, traditionally, then you have to let it go, and then you have the posted price, so-called posted price for the Persian Gulf, almost half of the Gulf of Mexico, despite the fact that this oil is more productive and there should be more royalty given to the owners of the oil in the Persian Gulf area. So, anyway, let me go one step further to look at the periodization of the petroleum industry. We should periodize because there is a qualitative change taking place. This is not quantitative change. There is a qualitative change. Therefore, periodization is very important. From one set of institutions and transformation to another, and so forth and so on. I guess, in the Anglo-Saxon world, I guess I was the first to do that. I don't know about Chinese or any other French who have done it or not. But I was the first in English. So this is the concession, in other words, the contract. And these are the characteristics of the contract. And that, of course, you can see the reflection of colonialism right there. Now, the second period, of course, is the transition period toward decartelization. The first period is full-fledged cartel. You cannot have any cartel so egregious to really be true to that name than International Petroleum Company. Now, in this period, as you can see, there has been nationalist awakening, as you pointed out very eloquently. You anticipated what I want to say. And colonial barriers and so forth. And then a regime of 50-50 profit sharing, even though the royalty given to the countries that they export oil is not 50-50 in this case, because the cartel used to take or hold a different set of books that nobody has seen. And then, of course, intangible drilling, all kinds of other costs, who knows what, and then whatever remains is divided 50-50. So you can imagine that it's not really 50-50, but we call it 50-50. I wrote in this extensive in this book, demonstrated why it is not. But anyway, but it's better than the previous one. In other words, the static form of royalty becoming dynamic. In other words, markets are penetrating, germinating. The capitalism itself is germinating beyond colonialism. And then the nationalization of oil, Iran, and Mossadegh. Of course, everybody talks about Mossadegh, anybody, I guess, these days. But then the question is that this guy was a Swiss educated, and he knew exactly what we are talking about. In other words, you can sit down and have a cup of coffee with this man here, right now. He said that we want to sell our oil to anybody. We don't want to have a monopoly of the British monopoly. That was a British monopoly. AIOC, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and so forth. But guess what? Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was part and parcel of the International Petroleum Cartel. So therefore, the cartel was the issue. And of course, the coup, I demonstrated many of my works, was because of oil. Not because of the so-called Cold War, because the documents which were released later on, piles of documents from the British side, from the American side, demonstrates that they knew Mossadegh is not a communist. And so, anyway. And then, of course, denationalization of oil. And now recently some of the scholars in history that period are taking notice of that. I've seen one book who said, yes, denationalization, because they thought this is national forever. It's not. And then, of course, formation of OPEC, which was in response to the cutting of the posted prices. Posted price, the price that the company, the International Petroleum Cartel, already said, this is the price. They cut that price in 59. And because the percentage of that, 12.5%, is a royalty to these exporting countries, they got mad. I said, we are abiding by the rules. This is your rule. Don't do that. And of course, some of these individuals, of course, a couple of them are very important. One is Alfonso of Venezuela, famous name, and of course, Authority of Saudi Arabia, which is very amazing. This is an irony that such a brilliant man, who also got his education in University of Texas, petroleum engineering, is representing Saudi Arabia, which was the most backward country at that time, among other things. So that is very important for us to know. Two important figures. And then, of course, rise of independent oil companies. We have in economics that freedom of entry or not, right? The argument that they make, no classical economists make. I'm not one of them anyway. That is freedom of entry. Freedom means what? That means force. Institutions are ready and making it to enter. And then, of course, the decartelization of 1972. The International Petroleum Cartel was collapsed. And then, guess what? At that particular year, 1972, Richard Nixon said that we don't want to have the quota which we established in 1959 against, the OPEC was formed because of that, actually. We don't want that. Of course, this was moot at that time. The whole thing is gone. cartel has gone. And then, of course, objectification of the center of gravity of the lower 48 states of the United States as a center of gravity, long-term determination of price for the entire world. And spot markets, you know, the arbitrary royalty gateway, all these things become rationalized, if you will. And then the question of security in the sense that control, right? Security means control. Anytime anybody said security related to oil, that person means control. Take it from me. And at the same time, dependency on the Middle East. When the center of gravity is here and the oil is internationalized, if you will, globalized, so what is the argument here, dependency on that in a physical sense? In the physical sense of the term, that they are essentializing it. Methodologists would argue that they're essentializing the argument rather than looking at the argument itself, the entity itself. And of course, the need for war. When oil is globalized, pick up your box, your wallet, and buy it in the market. You don't need to get it. You go to Iraq, and in Iraq, in the name of oil, supposedly, and then after that, look what happened. When you look at the contracts that they had after everything's said and done, some of the leftists, and I like them, but I disagree with them totally, argued that this is because of oil and so forth, American oil and so on and so forth. Look at the number of arrangements that they have done in terms of long-term or short-term or medium-term contracts that they have. Some of them were Americans, some of them were Russians, some of them were Chinese, Koreans, and others. So flying in the face of that argument. Therefore, my theory is right. So, and then of course, the question of national security. I was talking about the formation of OPEC, and in 1959, the tariff on the quota on Persian oil coming from the Persian Gulf area, from a variety of countries, because they didn't want to bring the oil which is connected to that region, because oil moved to the eastern border of the United States at that time. And that means that it was against the tenet of the Akhnakari. It was not because of anything else during the Eisenhower administrations. Therefore, our government was hand in glove, at that time, Eisenhower, with the Akhnakari and international petroleum cartel. And then this the Justice Department came in and said, look, in 1911, we did take apart this Standard Oil of Rockefeller already, 1911, right? That's a cartelization that can't be taking place in this country. Justice Department people said. State Department people solved the problem forever. They said it is a matter of national security. And that's the end of that. And that was phony. The documents would show that. Now, I want to have a bridge to Pax Americana. Therefore, I have to really define hegemony. And of course, the first person who argued this is Antonio Gramsci. Very, very famous and so forth. And of course, in political science, they got the drift of Gramsci, but they corrupted the argument. And then they translated the question of hegemony to domination. Hegemony is not domination. Look, I did unpack for many, many months, sitting down and packing the ideas. So, hegemony is spontaneously consensual. In other words, if there is a group of the leadership would really go for the interest of every member and then oneself on the top of it, rather than going to vacuum, if you will, and then control them in such a way. Internally arising, in other words, hegemony is dealing with a particular entity which is developing from within. Pax Americana is one of them, actually. I'll come back to this. Historically sanctioned. It belongs to a particular episode or period of history. You cannot cookie cut everything on hegemony. Like Genghis Khan went to Venice and hegemonically, it's not going to go. Structurally synthetic. In other words, it is dealing with a synthetic analysis, that there are many sides to deal with in a synthesis type analysis, in a dynamic sense rather than a static sense. Institutionally mediated, it should be mediated. In other words, you got to look at not the direct, it's not direct connection, but direct tie. It's mediating through the institution. So if we understand hegemony in this way, that's hegemony. If we understand the hegemony in this particular framework, then you cannot go bang people and then call it hegemony. Dominate and enter into different countries against the international law, by the way, and they call it hegemony. And then, of course, hegemony belongs to the whole, not the part, not the hegemon. When the whole is gone and raveled, there's no hegemony. In other words, the king doesn't have any cloth or coronet, whatever you want to call it. Now, the system. I wrote 45 because in 44 there was International Monetary Fund organizations like Bretton Woods and so forth, which I'm alluding to that. But then 45 was the real thing going on. And then 79. I'm deliberately using it 79, not 80. Because the last year of President Carter, which I like very much, by the way, was the last year of the Pax Americana. In other words, Jimmy Carter was the last president of the Pax Americana as a system. And then this was the end of history, particular history. History of the end of the American hegemony. As you recall, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. I have turned Fukuyama on his head in this case. This was the end of history, but this particular history, and the last man was Jimmy Carter. And if you look at the economic institutions of Pax Americana was a hegemonic system, by the way. Russians, in my judgment, didn't have hegemony, neither the Chinese. Now, this is Bretton Woods, the conference which led to the international monetary system in 1942. Lord Keynes came here, not here, Bretton Woods. And of course, went very upset because Treasury Secretary White, the government of the United States did not accept his proposal, which was monetary union, equal union. But they wanted to have hegemonic dollar, and in that sense, they got the upper hand. Institutions were with them. History was on their side, if you will, winners, and they got it. And then Keynes left 2 years after that. And then, what is the meaning of that? Direct dyeing with gold. I wrote this God, but I didn't want to. So I want to show it anyway. And then, of course, dollar is the messenger in that sense. If you really look at it, economists will laugh about this, and they know that's true. And International Monetary Fund was established, and World Bank and affiliated channels and institutions were established. These are real stuff. to change the world. They have merits, if you will, on the one hand. And of course, they have all kinds of misgivings about them later on. Marshall Plan for the post-war construction. Very, very important. Extremely important for Europe, for Japan, and other places. AID for the Third World. And I know for fact what AID did in Iran and other places. And Universal Land Reform Program, one of which was Kennedy's land reform in Iran during the Shah's time. Another was in Egypt, another was in Taiwan, another was in Brazil. I can go on and on and on, comparative. And also unfolding of a spirit of capital and capitalist relation. In other words, destroying the past and creating the new system altogether. And of course, this was the incubator of the transnationalization of social capital. In other words, we say social capital, sum total of the institutions, elements, developments toward globalization. And then, of course, as you can see, these are historical things from Bretton Woods. And then, of course, Lord Keynes is sitting right here, and of course, speaking here. And of course, he didn't cut the mustard with his proposal, obviously. And don't. So. And then, post-war, Pax America continued. Look at the question. We talked about the economic side of it very briefly, and that was in a very point by point. But then look at the polity, because polity is very important. The Iron Curtain speech by Churchill went to Missouri, small college, Westminster, in a town of 7,000 at that time, you know, a little bigger than it was. And then went with the jugular at that time. Russians didn't have the bomb at that time. So this guy, on behalf of the United States, went for the jugular. And then Soviet atomic bomb came to the market. And then, thanks to some of the same people in Princeton and the State Department later on, you know, many names. And then they organized the containment strategy. If you read the political science books, mostly international relations, they talk about containment of Soviets and containment worldwide. But actually, if you really look at the containment as a strategy, this has given all the coup d'etats against Mossadegh in 1953, against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, and I can go on and on. In Africa, for instance, Lumumba in 1960, and then even up to Allende, if you want to talk about it. The Kissinger-Nixon doctrine, as they say. They had been containment of the nationalist and democratic. When I talk about democratic movements, I'm not saying that in a non-dependent manner, democracy is messy. So, but give choices to people. And then, of course, the roots of democracy. Iran is a very important case in this, as you alluded, and you really saw what I'm talking about here, anticipated that from the 1953 coup d'etat, the whole world is paying for it, including the poor Iranians, 70-some million. One wrong move, and that's it. And then containment of the progressive political movements, including labor unions in the United States. Read that. This is our country. You have to know about it. This is huge. That's why the center was pushed to the right, compared with the Europeans. If you look at it, Europeans are, the liberals in Europeans are social democrats, American social democrats, right? Somehow. The conservatives in Europe may be liberal Americans, somehow, compared with the intellectual politics and so forth. This was the containment, which moved it to the right. Everything was moved to the right. Center was moved to the right. McCarthyism is a symbol of it, for instance. It's not just only McCarthyism. McCarthyism is a part. And then strategy of the Soviet Union. As you see, this is just live and let live war. The system was hegemonic. They didn't do unnecessary things. When they did it, they were hanging by the thread, and then you move back, if you will. The United States didn't become police state as a result of that. So that shows a step back and look at the hegemonic system, which can have capacity to come back. Okay? Globalization. The question is how this Pax Americana went out of business. I said 1979. But then when you look at the undoing of it, it's a process itself. The first thing was the Bretton Woods, because it was the first, right? It's almost like FIFO, right, in accounting. Okay. The balance of payments of the United States, of the United States economy, suddenly turned red, because we had a printing machine in our pockets, government had. And of course they created euro dollars and so forth and so on. And of course our allies, including Charles de Gaulle, came to us. He loved us. He said, don't do it to me. I want dollars. You said you have a direct deal with gold. Oh God, give me gold. 68. And then of course, that was during Nixon time. Of course, some of us may remember. And not many of us remember in this place, in this room. But anyway, but that's why the connection, it's disconnected, the dollar and gold. Some economists, by the way, let me make this point. Some economists argue that, well, this was a fixed exchange rate. Now we are moving to the flexible exchange rate. How easy, right? These economists are out to lunch. They didn't know that the entire system went belly up. And that is a part of the whole segment of the Pakistani economy altogether. That's why they couldn't really understand later on what globalization means, the system of globalization. And then of course, International Monetary Fund were wobbly and limping. And then if you look at the IMF, what is the role of IMF in the crisis of the late 90s? You just show me. They meant to say, we guaranteed that, but the core was the private banks, transnational banks, in that crisis. So I'm giving you evidence so that you know that I'm confident that I'm right. And then, of course, you look at World Bank. World Bank is a dinosaur. All these people, they did the job that they should do, of course, part and parcel of Pax Americana. And then the Pax Americana is gone. They're talking about poverty reduction. These guys created poverty, polarization of class, as some of us know, Latin Americans know, and so on and so forth. But then all of a sudden talk about poverty reduction. They don't have any other projects. This is a dinosaur. And 1973, and they're coming to oil, back to oil. 73 leads to globalization of oil. That was a crisis of globalization. Yes, OPEC came, and OPEC underestimated or overestimated itself. OPEC then was shut off at the end of the 1970s, and then of course with the development of the spot market and futures market in the early 1980s, OPEC was tamed. OPEC is a part and parcel of globalization itself. Went back to its own corner, along with the globalization process. And then of course, the question of transnationalization. In other words, capital shed its nationality. Not that we don't have big flags when the used car sales people are selling their cars. Of course they do. But the question is that, what are these cars? Where they're made? Where it's made of? What's the place of their? And then of course, plant closings of the 1980s during the height of the Reagan administration. I have a book, by the way, editing book, We spent 8 years on that with some of the scholars. It's in the library, take a look at it. We were cleaned out. The United States were cleaned out, literally. And economic crisis that is not global in nature. Now, when we look at the collapse of the international petroleum cartel, the post-war petroleum order that some of the people, including Yergin, the prize, the book, the thick book, he's a cheerleader of the international petroleum cartel. Talks about petroleum, post-war petroleum order. It's gone. And of course, revolution in Iran turned sour, but changed them. And Nicaragua. These are benchmarks, 1979. And the third world client subsystem, not the subsystem of the entire system of Acts and Liberia. And then the European community turned to European Union. Slowly but surely. Euro is born. Dollar is no longer lonely. Right? Globalization germinates, automotive poverty. In other words, globalization is creeping and encroaching on the political institutions. And then when we talk about polity, there is nobody to take care of this polity. That's why the people left and right talk about invade this, invade that. Whether we go, just recently, look at this week's question on Syria. Whether we go, let's go. Oh, we can't afford to go. Oh, we need to. They don't say that. This is not our right to do. They say we can't afford to go. That's pathetic in my judgment. And also, when you look at the policy making is not abiding by the previous system. The system is gone. Now the countries are cropping up, coming up. China is coming up and so forth. But make no mistake, in my judgment, no country will be hegemon. There will be hegemony of the social system called globalization, global capitalism. And in this case, if you look at hegemony, United States lost its hegemony by using force. And in this particular sense, they cannot get it back because hegemony depends on the social system and political system, which is no more. And this is contradiction in terms. Conclusion. These are a few things that I am looking in this book to some extent with the lens of globalization of oil. Which oil is not just a commodity, it's everything else because it's connected to polymer, other industries, feeding up to many other developments. It's almost like part of the hydrocarbon capitalism, if you believe. Some people argue about that. But I'm not going to make a big deal out of that, but it's important. And assessing the American hegemony, you have to look at what happened to oil. And the umbilical cord of the International Petroleum Cartel was caught in 1972. There goes the policy. And then if you look at some of the footnotes and other elements in this book, I've gone through demonstration of showing that how cartel was part and parcel of the U.S. foreign policy, National Petroleum Cartel. And then the question of competition in the presence of integration. This is an integrated world, right? This is not mom and pop world, right? This is a competition that oftentimes we forget, and Schumpeter of the 20th century talks about. This is a competition that Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Marx talked about in 18th, 19th century. This is not a competition which is made up in the minds of some of the neoclassical economists, like perfect and not perfect and that sort of thing, axiomatically. And understanding of OPEC today, OPEC is there because of differential oil rents, not because OPEC is creating differential oil rents. And differential oil rents are formed competitively because of the competitive competition between the different regions, and these are different cost categories and different productivities and so forth. It's a classical model. And then grasping the question of whether or not we are depending on the oil, depending on the Middle East oil. When the oil is become one globalized, what's Middle East oil? What's Latin American oil? What's American oil anymore? And then methodologically essentializing it is just is not good, is not true, and it's just distorting the fact. And then accepting energy independence. When we are connected in the interdependent world, and then the whole energy is unified in the sense that even our costs in the United States determine that. What's the meaning of independence, energy independence? We can have all kinds of fracking and things like that, in the United States, hydraulic fracturing and so forth. That can replace the regular oil in the lower 48 states of the United States. If that would replace it, these guys who are working over there, individuals and workers, they are going to go home. Remember that. And then the other question is that energy independence is just a pie in the sky. And then, of course, the question of globalization and negation of American hegemony, which, of course, we already talked about. And then collapse of the Pax Americana by internal forces. In other words, the methodology which will lead us to look at a phenomenon like biologists do. Look at the fetus. Look at the gestation period. Look at the baby, if you will. And look at the grown-up, process of growing up, process of death, if you will. Let's become a science rather than axiomatically thinking something and then looking for some counterparts, and by some other strike of luck get some numbers and so forth, and then come back and speculate, and then go back and thousands of times write many papers, perhaps for tenure or something like that, and then of course you don't know what the hell is going on at the end. And then of course the last thing is the question of military domination. Military domination proved wrong, proved very defeating, if you will. We lost in Iraq. There's not much to about. I'm demonstrating in this book. Afghanistan is gone already. And then we are thinking about Syria. Thank you very much.